Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the FNAF Files. Today, we're talking about and trying to answer the question of when did Fazbear Entertainment begin? In Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach, we could find posters advertising Fredbear's singing show with a cost of 50 cents for the entrance fee and showing a cartoon of Fredbear, an anthropomorphic bear who is yellow. He is drawn in the rubber hose animation style and with pie eyes, common characteristics of characters from the 1920s, 1930s, and or very early 1940s in cartoons. Now, many people explain this away as saying that the reason why it's in black and white is because up until the later half of the 1970s, color printers were not accessible to the general public, and it would have been very expensive for two people who are just starting out in business. And it would most likely just use regular black and white colored printers, which would have been more likely to be used. So some people say that possibly FNAF began in the 1920s, as these are characteristics of a 1920s cartoon. Now 50 cents adjusted for inflation in the 1920s adds up to about $8 or so. Now $7 to $8. Now in the 70s, it adds up to about $4 or so. Both are reasonable prices for an attraction of this kind, as it advertises food, beverages, music, and entertainment. Now, Game Theory believed that it was an actual bear in the beginning, and they really did have a bear performing, because the real-life traveling circuses or carnivals really did do that, as they would train bears to do tricks and do stunts. And, of course, in 1970, when We Know Fall Fest took place, they would not have been using bears like that, as those things are very, very inhumane. But I have a theory that the Fredbear singing show was an attraction as part of the 1970 Fall Fest, and that's where it all kicked things off, and that it wasn't actually a bear singing, but rather, most likely, William wearing a Fredbear costume singing. Now, hear me out here. The whole thing with them not being able to afford a color printers not existing for the public, make total sense. In 1970, those weren't accessible for the general public, and there's no way they would have had them in their possession. And alongside that, the Fall Fest was clearly a short-lived time carnival, and a bear singing and probably doing stuff would have been very much a thing you would see at a carnival. Now, Stuhl has been taking the game series in some crazy directions, but I don't think they would take them all the way back to the start of the century in the 1920s, and would have it outright to the point that William and Henry didn't even start the company, that they didn't make Fredbear, and that was some other random dudes. As Game Theory suggested that maybe it wasn't actually Fredbear, the character wasn't, by William, around he saw it, took inspiration, and it took the character and made his own in the 70s. That's a bit outlandish for Steel to do. So I think these are posters made to advertise the attraction at the 1970 Fall Fest, and it was simply a costume, as it was most likely William. We know he was the one to wear the Springlock suits, and in the novels we see him being very animated, cartoonish, and lively when he wears the Spring Bonnie costume. And we know costumes are clearly a thing that the company used, as they worked with Edwin Murray, who we played inside of his mansion in the newest game, with Five Nights at Freddy's Secret of the Mimic, as we would find prototype Springlock animatronic suits for Fredbear, Spring Bonnie, and later and a gator that would later become Montgomery Gator, or known as Monty. And there are, of course, costumes for various characters, and clearly costumes are a big part of the company's early days, as we would see the Mimic in Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach in its DLC wearing them, and we would find them scattered around the underground section near the end of the game. So these are most likely, costumes are clearly going to play a very, very big important part in the story, as clearly the Steel was trying to take us back to the early days of Five Nights at Freddy's. So and the 50 cents entrance fee is very reasonable, even for the 1970s, especially for a carnival attraction. about $4 to go see, a guy in a bear suit, singing, probably doing stuff. But if we take the novels in for account, we see that when he was wearing the spring bodysuit, he would juggle, and so maybe they would have seen, the bear guy in the bear costume juggling, which would have been quite a feat to do. And of course, him singing, of course, that would have been something people probably would have paid for, especially all the way back in 1970. Yeah, that would have been quite a thing. And we do there was most likely some kind of fire, probably definitely at the 1970 Fall Fest. And maybe the fire was why they decided to stop with the Fall Fest and start their own permanent location down somewhere in their own place instead of with a seasonal attraction. And this was the starting place so they could start their own thing. So they could start their own thing later down the line with Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and later Fredbear's Family Diner. And it also makes sense, too, that the earlier this starts, the earlier the Fazbear animatronic characters are made. Because Phone Guy says in FNAF 1 that they hadn't had a bath in about 20 years. 1993, most likely when the game takes place, minus 20, 1973. Though he's probably, not literally saying actually 20 years, probably like the general years, but most likely Freddy Chica Bonnie, Apollo Foxy was created sometime in the early to mid 1970s, and we know Chica already existed as her own separate entity, so we'll just count her out here. But the earlier the timeline starts, the more earlier we would see animatronics coming around, and as he's talking about the animatronics, it would just make sense. It would just make logical sense. The earlier it starts, the sooner we would see animatronics, and more time period for a 20-ish year gap between 1990, early 1990s, and the early to mid 1970s. And so that's what I think is happening here. We are simply just seeing advertisements for the first Fall Fest, as clearly Seal is putting an emphasis on Fall Fest, and costumes are going to be clearly a big thing, and that's what I think this was. As of course the whole thing, with the food and beverages, when you go out to a place like Fall Fest, which is like a carnival, they have hot dogs, because the whole thing of carnivals and stuff like that, it's traveling shows, there's all kinds of food, there's all kinds of drinks there, all kind of deep fried things, they deep fry everything there, they deep fry Mars bars there, that's kind of the whole point, there's food there, and hot dogs, pretzels, so it made even bigger sense that would have been part of the main advertising there. That would be part of the main advertising there. And of course, we have other colored posters for Fredbears, and it's referred to as Fredbear for Fredbears. Also found in Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach. These are colored, so we can most likely assume these are a completely different thing from the black and white one. Most likely at the 1983 location where we see the bite of 1983 happen, and that so these are several years removed, but they clearly do look similar enough that you could say that's the same character, and not to the because if it really was some random thing in the 1920s, first of all, how exactly would William get the rights to it? Because as the map path theorized, William would have been a child when he saw, the whole Fredbear singing show in the 1920s, 40s. How would he even track down, to get the rights? Or if he just outright stole the character, he may not have gotten sued because he probably would have been dead. But even then, this guy probably made his own thing. He probably not have wanted to, something like that. Probably want to make his own thing. And again as well, I don't think Steel will take us that far back. It's too far. I don't think Steel Wolf would do that. It just wouldn't make sense either. That's how to have the story starts a completely unremoved thing. That's like some bear, random real bear, and of course, unless they were like painting them yellow or just a regular brown bear with like a bow tie on, it makes more sense. It makes more sense that Fredbear would probably just a yellow colored bear suit, and it seems like something William and Henry would do instead of trying to use an actual bear. It just makes logically sense, story-wise sense that the Fazbear Singing Show posters were for 1970 Fall Fest, and that's where the story starts. The year 1970, in the fall of 1970, Fazbear Entertainment got started with a sideshow attraction at a seasonal carnival run by two young men named Henry Remley and William Afton, where they made a yellow bear costume together, and one of them wore, probably juggled, definitely sang for people eating deep fried food, drinking sodas, and all kinds of other snacks and beverages. That's all I gotta say, ladies and gentlemen. Bye, have a nice time.